Like, if anything, the bestiality and vegetarian example makes me more pro bestiality than I would have been before.
But my parents, who rarely listen to the podcast, went on a road trip to Vancouver and decided to listen to our most recent episode on AI. Apparently, our roles have reversed because now I'm swearing every second word, and they were so impressed that you weren't swearing at all. So my like the only feedback my mom had for me was, yeah, pretty nice episode. It's amazing that Vaden doesn't swear. He's so good about not swearing and yet staying so passionate. And then she kind of fades to silence, and I say, okay, what about me? And she says, oh, it's terrible. You're swearing all the time.
It's so funny. There is an old clip of us talking about long-termism, so it's kind of apropos, that somebody recirculated on Twitter. And I was just swearing like a sailor. And now I'm like a bit more self-conscious about how much I curse. And so I'm trying to limit it a little bit. But it's hilarious that your mom picked up on it.
I know.
And it wasn't all the brilliant things that you and I said that was important, of course. It was the profanity or the lack of...
I was dropping F-bombs left, right, and center.
But should we fill up our drink and get into this topic for today? I don't know. How do you feel? Anything you want to say last minute before we dive into it?
No, I guess not. Let's just rip off the Band-Aid, get it over with.
Okay, let's go. Okay, let me go fill up my drink. And
nice. All right, same.
Cool. Well, let me set up this conversation, and then you're going to do an opening burst because I don't know how to even summarize my thoughts. But so today we are talking about William MacAskill's newest book, What We Owe the Future. This is my good friend Benjamin Chugg from Carnegie Mellon University. I'm Vaden Masrani from University of British Columbia. And we, in episodes past, have talked a lot about long-termism. Kind of stepped away from the conversation for a year or so, but MacAskill's come up with his latest book, and we both read it and have a lot of thoughts about it. And I think today we're just going to go back and forth a little bit, talk about what we liked, what we didn't like. It's kind of it alternates between being a tough book to summarize versus being almost trivially obvious to summarize. So I'm struggling to come up with a coherent opening monologue. So Ben volunteered to do so, and I'm going to react to what you think. But that's my setup. So
it's generous to say I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure. I feel like every day I wake up and I think about it more. I go back and forth as to like what's actually going on and how profound I think it is. So I think maybe a helpful backdrop is considering Peter Singer's work on global poverty in like the 1970s. And in particular, like, he wrote this influential philosophical article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, sometime in the 1970s. And I think the goal there was to like catalyze a moral revolution, so to speak. So, he sort of made these arguments that there's these people living halfway around the world and they're suffering a lot, and we're spending money on pretty inconsequential things. And with that money, there's good evidence that we can like improve their quality of lives drastically and even save their lives in some instances. And basically arguing that we should do that. Okay, so that's a thesis. You can agree or disagree, but if you adopt that thesis, the consequences are very actionable. So MacAskill, I think, acknowledges that he's also trying to catalyze a moral revolution, but this time thinking about people in the future. He's got these 3 phrases sometime at the beginning of the book that basically sums up the thesis. I think like future people matter. We can...
So yeah, future people count. There could be a lot of them, and we can make their lives go better.
I just noticed your screen name on here is Vaden the Merciful.
Yeah. I just thought it was funny to change the name. Yeah, glad I got a laugh.
So he's trying to tell us that, like, Singer was saying we should be concerned about people halfway around the world, and MacAskill saying we should be concerned about people thousands, hundreds, thousands, even millions of years in the future. And he wants this to like revolutionize sort of our moral landscape and how we go thinking about the world. But after that, the analogy kind of breaks down, because while it's more clear what we can do to help people halfway around the world, obviously you run into the problems that just like predicting the future is quite hard. And so it's much less obvious what we can do to help people in the far future. And my basic read of the book is that he's trying to argue that there are things we can do to positively impact this future. But I don't think he can escape the black hole of uncertainty that surrounds trying to help people so far in the future. And because of that, ends up focusing on problems that are quite present and pressing right now, right? So he ends up focusing on pandemics, whether engineered or natural, ends up focusing on climate change, ends up focusing on trying to promote economic growth and avoid nuclear war, all things that are very pressing problems that I'm also concerned about, that I love that people are talking about. But after he finishes, it's very unclear what the long in long-termism is supposed to do for us,
exactly.
Right? These are all problems that you can focus on without adopting his thesis that we should care about people a billion years in the future. So sort of the delta between our current concerns and what the book advocates we think about is pretty small. But because he's trying to be so expansive in his claims, he ends up not really zooming in much on any of the particular problems and just sort of says at a high level, we should think about these problems more carefully and perhaps give more money to them, which perhaps is fine. But if you're trying to catalyze a moral revolution, I kind of expected some more actionable things. Like if everyone's going to wake up as a long-termist tomorrow, what would change? And I'm not sure that much would change, because now we'd just be in the position about all arguing what we're supposed to do to make the future better. And I think that's what largely we're trying to do anyway, all the time right now. I think, we all have opinions about the direction that we want to see the world go. And that's in part why people disagree about shit all the time. And these questions are very hard, like what we do about climate change, what we do about nuclear war. These are intense questions touching on philosophy and geopolitics and technology and economics. And it's fine to write a book saying these are hard problems and we should think about them. But it's sort of inherently inactionable because he can't give actual solutions to all these problems in one book, right? Because they're all like very deep problems. And so I'm just kind of left not sure what I'm supposed to take away from it.
I love that. I completely agree. And just to give a flavor of what you're talking about with the actionable or lack thereof characteristic of this book. So at the end, he gives three concrete recommendations for what we should do. And they are, first, take actions that we can be comparatively confident are good. 2, try to increase the number of options open to us. And 3, try to learn more. And I get to this point in the book, I'm thinking, well, what is long-termism actually doing to arrive at these recommendations? So if listeners go and check out our episodes from the archive about long-termism, you'll hear us be quite opinionated that it's a bad idea. And we are critiquing a paper that he wrote with Hilary Greaves called The Case for Strong Long-termism. And it seems like he's just taken out all of the stuff that we were criticizing, and we're left with a book that I just feel like I don't really know what the point of the book is. Like, he's trying to make this case for caring about the future, but when it comes to anything is actionable, you basically don't need it. Most of his recommendations for what we should do are things like find energy sources that are less polluting, try to prevent bioterrorism, try to prevent nuclear weapons. And all this is, from my perspective, just a trivially, obviously good thing to do. And then the stuff that goes a little crazy is the AI stuff. And he's significantly downplayed that in this book, which I can't tell if that's to his credit or not. There's a blog post written about this book by an effective altruist author who is much more long-termist than MacAskill seems to be. And he said, and I agreed with this critique a lot, because he said that he feels that people are going to get they're going to experience a bit of a bait and switch, where they read the book and they think, oh, this is all kind of reasonable and maybe obviously true. And then they go have an 80,000 hours phone call, or they go to any effective altruist clubs, or they join the forum and they see that the majority of what people are actually talking about is AI safety and AGI superintelligence taking over the world. They're going to be kind of taken aback, because the AI stuff, which is a lot of what you and I were critiquing in previous conversations, has basically been reduced to half a chapter. And it's only one of 10 things that he recommends. But there's then long-termism in the wild, which is a very different beast, which is kind of created by MacAskill and Greaves and Ord and stuff. But this book doesn't really represent that, it seems to me. It represents this very watered down version of it that is hard. It's just a unsatisfying read from my perspective. There's some things I liked, and we'll talk about what some good parts were, but it just seems to be so watered down that what's actually presented to the public is this weird mix between trying to make extreme rather extreme claims about the billions of people in the future. But then when it bottoms out to what he actually recommends, it's like, try to learn more. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Obviously I want to learn more. So I just found it this weird superposition of being like extreme, but then banal at the same time. And I couldn't totally grab onto it. I don't, does any of that land with you or resonate?
Totally. So, I mean, so the last chapter is about basically summarizing some success stories, of people who he thinks are doing good work. But from what I can tell, most of them are not actually, or at least were not originally motivated by like the EA community. Like maybe they found some solidarity in the mission in their work. But for example, he like cites Isabel Bomaki, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Who's like doing nuclear power activism, which is fantastic. Like I love what she's doing. I don't think she did it for long-termist reasons. I didn't think she did it because she saw a huge political problem wherein people were pushing only renewables at the expense of nuclear, and this was like causing huge energy demand. It was a bad idea, so she started talking about it in public. She didn't need to be motivated by long-termism to do that, because I almost agree with everything, maybe modulo some of the AI stuff, but I mean, even there, most of the actual money, when they talk about AI stuff, it's different from where the actual money's going. Typically, it's just going to like run-of-the-mill AI research, which is great. But anyway, so the last chapter is like, I agree with basically all of these causes that he's talking about. But then I'm like, well, it's kind of unfair to credit this to long-termism. Like, I think they would have been doing this anyway. And so maybe that's unfair, right? Like maybe he would say, well, what I'm trying to argue is not that there's a whole new set of problems we should focus on. It's instead a reshuffling of our priorities. So it's not that I'm saying no one up to now has been focused on nuclear war or engineered pandemics or something, but I just want people to take that problem much more seriously, which perhaps is fair.
Again, we don't need long-termism to do that. Like there was like X-risk was in the culture well before the phrase long-termism went into the culture. And people like after the pandemic, people are going to obviously be putting much more money and time into pandemic awareness and not awareness, pandemic preparation, preparedness. And similarly with nuclear weapons and stuff. And so it's like, do I need to make all these tortured philosophical arguments about the importance of people a billion years in the future? Or can I just make down-to-earth concrete arguments about the importance of like nuclear energy, of cleaning up like fossil fuels, of preventing bioterrorism? Like these, we don't need to go this route. We only need to go this route for the AI stuff, which he's downplayed so significantly that I feel weird critiquing him for that in this book, because I don't want to critique him for stuff he hasn't written, but it's also, I don't think it's an accurate representation of what long-termism is as practiced by people who call themselves long-termist in the effective altruist community. And again, I will just cite this person who's way more long-termist than MacAskill is, critiquing MacAskill basically on this point, that he didn't adequately or accurately represent how long-termism is being approached in the community. So I'm in this weird place where it's like, well, do I want to critique long-termism as practiced by the community, where I basically think it's like this techno-utopian ideology? Or do I want to critique long-termism as he's presented it here, which is, it's almost like reading a defense of Islam by a very, very, very moderate Muslim, where you don't want to just critique it because it could lead to fanaticism, but you know that there's a fanaticism part of it in existence as well. And I'm just in this weird place where, and I honestly think that, so there's the case for strong long-termism 1, and then there's a second case for strong long-termism where they redid the paper and they took out everything that we quoted as problematic. So in some sense, I'm reading this book thinking that a lot of the stuff that you and I said and wrote actually influenced what is in the book and what's not in the book. Because I can't say that for sure, but the evidence for that is that like Shivani and every quote that we raised was stripped for the new version of the case for strong long-termism, and none of that's in this book. And so is this even representing what long-termism is as practiced by the people who call themselves long-termist? I don't think it necessarily is. Yeah, I felt that way, especially about, so at the beginning of the book, like I kind of expected him to do, he introduced like the tool of expected value reasoning, right? And he said, this is how we're going to reason about things. But then he barely uses it. So he does a bit. So he'll talk about like the probability of certain things happening, and the usual conflation happens between his like just guess of what the probability is and like some true probability. But he because
if you were to actually take expected value seriously, you'd actually be able to like rank order all these problems, right? And he'd say, because the whole point of expected value calculation is supposed to be able to tame uncertainty using the numbers, right? That's the whole idea. And so you'd be able to bundle all the uncertainty about like which problem to focus on, how much more money to put into that versus some other cause that we're thinking about. Be able to bundle that all into the calculation and give very explicit rankings of how, you know, how much more time and energy should put to problem A versus problem B. He doesn't do that for good reason, because that would come across as insane to an ordinary reader, right? And be like, well, this is crazy.
But he does cite people who do, and he seemed almost sheepish about assigning probabilities to stuff. Like he buried some probabilities in footnotes and things. But then he would cite affirmatively Toby Ord, who does this.
Right,
and
yeah.
He has a weird relationship to it. So keep going.
Yeah. But so it's there, but in the background. But that's what I mean. Sort of like there's like only a partial commitment. And so it's hard to criticize, because I do agree with most of his right. Like I also am worried about technological stagnation. I'm obviously worried about, I also don't want to fall into like some totalitarian dictatorship. That also seems bad, right? I also want, you know, moral change to like not be locked in forevermore. The part of long-termism that we took issue with earlier was because they were giving like very precise, like you should donate to AI over malaria bed nets because it's better by a factor of 1,500 to 1 or something.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And then it was pointing out, okay, well you're not comparing like with like, there's some problems here with your calculations. But because he doesn't make any of those calculations, yeah, you're just kind of left with this like, there's some problems. People should think harder about these problems, which again is like, I'm like, okay, maybe that's good. Like, well, so I do want people to be more concerned about like nuclear war or something, right? Like I think on average, if more people are concerned about like just aware of the fact that there's still a huge nuclear arsenal in the world, that would be a good thing. And so I don't want to say it's not bad or that he shouldn't have written the book or something. It's just the content. It's like the logical consequences of what comes out of the book. If you take the book and be like, what do I do based on this book? It's like very, very small, like logical content that this book has. Yeah,
I totally agree. And to the expected value thing, something that I noticed him doing in this book and in podcast conversations is, so it's not assigning explicit probabilities to stuff, although he does do that and he hides some of it in the appendix and he's kind of like almost embarrassed to do it, I feel. But he will propose scenarios which are in direct contradiction with one another, and talk about both of them as being plausible. And this is allowed under the expected value reasoning. So, for example, he's very worried about AGI superintelligence taking over the world, and he's also worried about technological stagnation. So he's asking us to imagine one future scenario where technology just increases in its capabilities and the speed of development of technology grows and grows and grows and grows. And then there's another scenario where technology slows down, stops. This is kind of like writing a book where you're worried about overpopulation and you're worried about underpopulation, or you're worried about the climate heating up and the climate cooling down. And it's not a contradiction because under the expected value calculus, these are all equally plausible scenarios, and you just assign probabilities to them. But he's not really on the line. He's not advocating a position which then can be falsified by another book. He just can talk about everything happening all at once. So I wrote down a number of these like explicit contradictions that I just called it having it both waysism. So he'll talk about how we can make a big difference to future generations. And then later on, he talks about how the future is impossible to predict, and anything that we do, the consequences of these are like ripples in a pond. And he'll talk about technological progress speeding up and technological progress slowing down. And he'll talk about how the resiliency of human beings and how we're able to constantly overcome problems and hurdles and difficulties. Then he'll talk about how we're at a significant risk of being taken over by a totalitarian government or a super AGI. And so this is this like weird consequence of this expected value reasoning where you don't have to commit yourself to any one position. You can kind of just have them all at the same time. And it's weird because you could just like swap all the arguments, and you could use all the arguments for technological stagnation as being reasons why we shouldn't worry about AGI superintelligence. Similarly, you can take all the arguments from AGI superintelligence and use that as reasons why we shouldn't be worried about technological stagnation. And so it's hard to grab onto because he does it all at once. And then if you argue against any one particular thing, he'll just say, well, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty. Let's reduce our probability for that. And so you can never really pin him to anything. And then in like podcast conversations and stuff, Tyler Cowen asked him about long-termist implications for abortion. And shouldn't you, if you care about future generations, shouldn't you be pro-life? And you want there to, and similarly, he tried to pin him down on stuff like expected value reasoning. Like, would you want to have if there's a button that you could press that would have like 51% chance of like giving everyone infinite life and 49% chance of killing everyone, would you
or even just
button?
Doubling the population or something, right?
Yeah.
It was like, yeah.
And then he'll just say, well, yeah, so expected value reasoning doesn't get you all the way, and we have to have a plurality of views. And then he'll just basically abandon it whenever there's a tough question thrown at him. And it's like, what is this even doing for you besides being a rhetorical device? Like, I just see it now as kind of a rhetorical device that's being used, because he's not committing himself to actually using any of the calculations. He just talks about it, but then when challenged, abandons it at the first sense of challenge, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay. Let me try and defend just a subset of that, which is if you write a book, I could imagine someone writing a book saying underpopulation would be bad because it would slow down progress. People are awesome, etc. So we don't want everyone to stop having kids all of a sudden, because that would be bad. Mm-hmm. But similarly, we don't want the population to explode within a generation or something. Right. So we should simultaneously be worried about, I'm not saying this is my position. I'm just saying, you can imagine someone writing a book saying we should be, we don't want underpopulation and we don't want overpopulation. I don't view that as like having it both ways. I just view that as like pointing out two possible problems. And then you can like, I don't know if that's a consequence, one, of the expected value calculus, or just, I think he's just trying to point out a lot of possible problems. And then we can debate about the feasibility of those scenarios.
I don't think the analogy is someone writing a book saying underpopulation is bad, overpopulation is bad. I think the analogy would be someone writing a book saying underpopulation is likely and overpopulation is also likely. And it's not a contradiction, because under this framework, basically, you can just speculate wildly about stuff that might happen. But it does, I think, strain credulity a little bit to talk about two possible futures which are diametrically opposed to one another. And if you're a reader of this book, and let's say I think that technological stagnation is really likely, and you think that AGI superintelligence is really likely, we're going to donate money to two competing organizations, one of which is trying to accelerate technological growth and the other is trying to hinder it. And what's frustrating is it's not a contradiction. I recognize it's not a contradiction. It's just the way that this kind of expected value reasoning allows you to think. And you can just speculate wildly. So I want to talk about some of the stuff I liked about the book, because there was some stuff that was genuinely fascinating, but maybe we'll do that in a bit. But there's just certain claims that he made that I just thought were flat out absurd. So one of them is, I'll suggest that there's a significant chance of a third world war in our lifetime. I don't know how anyone can possibly know that. Like, it's just speculation. Yeah. And to say that there's a significant chance is I just think.
I think he also says 1 in 3 at some point, right?
Oh, I didn't see that. Maybe he did. Sorry, I didn't see that. And he'll say things like, if we could create genetically engineer scientists to have greater research abilities like Einstein, this would compensate for fewer people overall. And it's like, what are you talking about? How could you possibly genetically engineer better research? But you're just allowed to speculate about the future like this, and you're not constrained to anything besides certain chunks of it being plausible when phrased one way. But then you read diametrically opposed arguments like a couple chapters later, and you kind of just forget that like he's not contradicting himself. He's just exploring every possible future that could happen all at the same time in a way that you can never pin him down on anything, and it's all probabilistic. And it's just, I found it very frustrating.
Well, and it leaves all the work to the reader, right? So it's like he's saying, well, this could happen, and this could happen, and this could happen. And then the question is, okay, what should we do about that? Like, how do we start arguing? How do we debate about which one to do? And just by pointing out all the scenarios, again, like, maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a role for that. Like,
but then when it bottoms out to stuff that people were doing anyways. It's like,
exactly. Yeah. Like he was on the
what's the extra value of doing this? Sorry, go ahead. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah. So, but as an example, like, So yeah, he went on the Tim Ferriss podcast. I mean, they must have pulled out all the stops on their connections.
His podcast
because he was on every podcast in my podcast. But I was just like, this is wild.
And
like,
with the exception of Sean Carroll and Tyler Cowen, everybody else was just like fawning over this book. Like even Sam Harris, and I like have a huge amount of respect for Sam Harris, but I thought he was given such an easy pass on all this whole podcast circuit. Everyone's just like, oh, he's a moral philosopher. He must be a saint. Again, I'm kind of just bitching about things that annoyed me.
Well, because but this is like, sometimes I wake up and I'm like today I just, like woke up, I'm like walking to the gym and I'm like looking up at the stars, and I do sometimes, like emotionally, I can like resonate with what he's saying. Like, I think humans are fucking awesome. I want us to like go to the stars. If we are the only like conscious creatures in the universe, the observable universe or whatever, and we did go extinct, I do think that would be a huge tragedy. So it's not like I'm not concerned about like future people, the future of the species. Like, I want all the good things to happen to us. Insofar as the book makes people think more about that, and forget like some of the more parochial problems, and like the classic thing of astronauts going to the space station and be like, oh, it's just a single blue dot, everything's so precious and stuff. Those kind of insights are good, and I do maybe want more people to register that. I think that's my most robust defense, is just like, insofar as he's talking about that humans are pretty good and we should want our future to be awesome, and also that we should take our actions and our ideas seriously, right? Like, one through line of the book is our ideas do matter, and we, if we fuck up, we can fuck it up big, and nothing's on autopilot, right? Things have gone bad in history before. If we don't stay serious about the power of ideas, then like civilization can collapse and stuff. And all those messages are great because, I mean, there's one contingent of people in the US especially who like think civilization is terrible anyway, right? And or just think like no one has the power to do anything and people are super apathetic and stuff. And so insofar as he's countering messages like that, like fuck yeah, like and so sometimes I'm like, can kind of get behind him, like make people think more about this. And like he talks about the value of having kids, which I thought was pretty cool, which no one really wants to talk about anymore, and I was very impressed by, right? Especially because that's so contra current environmentalist messaging, right? So the fact that he took a stand, and he said that on multiple podcasts too, so kind of took a stand like, like having kids is a great thing to do.
Totally.
And so sort of the messages like that, I'm like, hell's yeah. But then I mean, once you get into very particular problems, I just thought it was quite shallow how he dealt with it. And like one example, he was talking about the green movement in Germany, and how about they sort of catalyzed a bunch of money to go into renewables. And he said, this made renewables a much more respectable thing, made other countries take it more seriously, etc. But what he neglected was that push for renewables also made Germany disband tons of their nuclear plants, which has now landed them in massive problems when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? And just environmentally in general. And so, but this is a perfect example of how he kind of skates over the complexities when he's dealing with these concrete problems, right? Like, imagine being someone who like has spent your whole life thinking about pandemics or nuclear war or something. He's really not adding anything new to the table. He's just saying this is a problem. And you might be kind of annoyed if you were an expert in this area. Like, well, what the fuck? I fucking know it's a problem. Like, I'm down here trying to do all the geopolitical heavy lifting to like figure out how to do this stuff. And you're kind of just giving me vacuous statements about how it's important. Anyway, that kind of sums up my my conflicting feelings. Yeah,
well, since we're getting to like some of the good parts of the book, I should kind of give a bunch of examples of things that I liked. And I totally agree with you that it was refreshingly like pro-human, progress. One thing that I thought was nice about the book is that there were, and you kind of alluded to this, but didn't say it explicitly, but there's like zero traces of wokeism in it. Which I just thought was nice.
Quite refreshing.
Just quite refreshing. And so he's kind of presenting a different lens, but just in terms of being tainted by seeing oppression everywhere and stuff, there's zero traces of that, which I thought was great. And there's a lot of climate optimism too, which I thought was interesting. Which was nice. Like he talked about climate change being a problem, but it's not but he also acknowledged that we're making real progress on climate change, and that I think he says somewhere that recent years have given us more cause for hope than any other point in my lifetime. And he pushed back strongly on the climate movement's encouragement to people for people to not have children. I thought that was great that he was is very like a Pinker style optimism, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
And at the end of the book, so just kind of going through a bit of a list of things that I thought was great about it. At the end, I thought he gave some really great career advice. And his career advice was basically to treat your career like an experiment. And so he says, in practical terms, you might follow these steps. Research your options, make your best guess about the long-term path for you. Try it for a couple of years, update your best guess, and repeat. And this is just perfectly Popperian advice about how to make a good career. And I thought that was great. And there's just a couple random points that he made that I just wanted to highlight because I didn't hear these said on podcasts before. But he made the very excellent point that I thought was just such an obviously good idea that I can't believe I hadn't heard of it or thought of it, which is that not a single country allowed the vaccine to be bought on the free market prior to testing by those who understood the risks, even on the condition that they report whether they were subsequently infected. Just this idea that there could have been and should have been a free market for COVID vaccines amongst volunteers, I thought was a really important insight, and one that I hadn't heard before. And so just props to MacAskill for saying that.
Regarding the vaccines, he made some fascinating points there. One, he pointed out how homogenous the global, more or less, how homogenous the global response to COVID was. Obviously, there was some regional variation, right? South Korea comes to mind, right? But if you consider the massive space of possible responses to something like COVID, and then how little of that space was inhabited by most countries, even when other stuff seems like actually quite good ideas, like challenge trials, etc., that was quite interesting. And then he follows that up by saying he proposed the idea of charter cities. So did you have a thought there? That was quite interesting.
At first, I thought that was super interesting. And then I started to think, well, what's the difference between charter cities and just different cities?
How do you implement it?
So maybe you should say for the audience what charter cities are first before I opine on it a little bit. But.
Yeah. So, so my understanding is they're sort of independent regions. So they wouldn't be bound to a specific country, say. And there'd be cities that are trying out a specific, perhaps economic plan. So he kind of hedges and says, it could be different moral views, or it could be different economic views, but maybe you have a charter cities for like democratic socialists who want to try something more along that vein. Then you have a charter city for libertarians or anarcho-capitalists or something who want to live in a much different way, right? And everything's voluntary and stuff, but you have these cities that are trying out very different experiments on how to live. And so that civilized, we can kind of see it's running little experiments, what's going to work, what's not going to work. Obviously, there's some practical issues, right? How are these systems economic? They have to relate to each other economically somehow. We need global free trade and whatnot to some extent, and so they have to be bound in some sort of social international norms and stuff. So the details seem quite fuzzy, but I can get behind the general sentiment that we should be running more experiments. So
at first, I liked it, but then I don't see how you could implement this without being an authoritarian, totalitarian. You could do it in China, I guess, but you have to give people free movement.
For sure.
And then you have to decide how a city's going to, which economic policy a city's going to implement. And to do that, again, in a non-totalitarian way, it has to be democratically elected policies. And then you just have people voting for economic policies in different geographical regions, which I think just gets us back to regular cities. I don't know how you would go, how would we do this in Canada or the United States, for example? You could get a bunch of libertarians and they would go off to would we just take existing cities and replace libertarians, or replace the people with a bunch of libertarians and stuff? It just doesn't seem like it's at all feasible to do without violating civil liberties.
Maybe, I can kind of see natural experiments arising as long as you let cities be a little more autonomous in their lawmaking. So I'm considering something like San Francisco versus Austin, Texas, right? So San Francisco tends to have people who vote for like much more state intervention, right? They might vote on much more left-leaning policies. And that's going to also attract people who think that's a better idea. Okay. San Francisco is not having a great time at the moment, right? And so that could almost be considered one type of experiment. Obviously, San Francisco is still bound by like certain state laws and stuff. So what you might want to say is like, okay, now San Franciscans can just like vote on everything. They don't have to abide by the state regulations. They just vote on everything. And then people don't like that, which seems to be a lot of people, are like moving out of San Francisco, moving into places like Austin, Texas. And, Texas tends to be more on the libertarian side of things. So these are not like mandated charter cities, but they're getting closer to that sort of idea, right? Like San Francisco right now is definitely an experiment in living, one that arguably is not. But there's
a big difference between collecting data and analyzing natural experiments. So experiments which have just naturally taken place based on people's free choice and movement and voting policies, versus implementing this as a strategy and saying we are going to decide that San Francisco is going to be more blue and Austin, Texas is going to be more libertarian or what have you. So because as charter cities were proposed in the book, it seemed like it was like experiments that would be run by who exactly? I just don't know how you could do this except without being like a China and just forcing people to live in places. And so it was an interesting idea for sure. But then when I thought a bit more about it, I don't know how you could do it without
possibly implement it. I was just thinking also there's an issue. I was talking about this with Mira, and we were talking about some of the difficulties. She was like, well, okay, but what if you want to have what if like a city of people come together, right? So you could think of like certain religious extremists who are like, we want to live in a state where women have no say in how they live, right? And so are you just going to allow that to happen because it's like quote unquote an experiment in living? Like probably not. It's so it still has to be even a charter city idea. It can't be anything goes, right? It still has to be implemented in some sort of like liberal order or something. So you can only push it so far.
So here, what did you think about the whole value lock-in? Because I'm slightly skeptical, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Maybe we should summarize for the audience what value lock-in is.
Sure. I mean, I guess, even more broadly, maybe we should just give a slight outline of the book because we've been talking freeform so far, but we should say right. So he's concerned about the long-term future, but he breaks the book into several parts. And parts 2 and 3 talk about two sort of distinct ways that you might go about influence in the future, or ways in which the future could be good or bad. Part 2 is about trajectory changes. And so this is about values basically over time. So the two subparts of that are about moral change and value lock-in. Value lock-in being like if we got locked into some totalitarian dictatorships or something, like say the Germans had won the Second World War and we were all living in the 1,000-year Reich at the moment, that would be like a form of value lock-in. Assuming like it couldn't be changed or something. And that's where he gets into some of the AI stuff. Like AI could help with cementing totalitarian values.
Yeah, it was the AGI that was like the driver of the value lock-in. Although he didn't say that explicitly, the main arguments for value lock-in were about AGI. So that's where the AGI stuff came in. Yeah.
And then the next part is about safeguarding civilization. And this is, I would say, most of what we've been talking about so far. So like the extinction risk, technological stagnation, civilizational collapse, things that you most commonly associate under like the sort of the broad umbrella of like more existential risk type stuff. So what did I think of the value lock-in? I thought there are parts that were of great merit. Like there are some fascinating historical case studies of how certain ideas emerged over time and were able to like win out against other ideas and became entrenched. And so like he gives a whole background on Confucianism and the Han Dynasty and the Maoists, right? And like how they were sort of battling for prestige, and then how Confucianism like ended up winning out over time and basically cemented itself as a certain ideology over the span of like 2,000 years. And so parts of it are just testament to like how powerful ideas are and how much we should care about spreading norms of like open inquiry and debate and making sure that, I mean, basically like the classic liberal values of like free speech, and people need to be allowed to point out what they see as problems and talk about things, right? Because we don't want to get ourselves in a situation where we don't tolerate dissenting views in case we're sliding into some sort of bad moral system or something.
I found the value lock-in stuff to be a little difficult to conceptualize because I think values tend to get locked in when they are maximally beneficial to the most amount of people. The historical examples all run into the problem that you just didn't have global communication back then. So you didn't have ideas being able to be spread quickly. Also, when you go back that far in time, we just weren't as morally or scientifically developed. It was pre-Enlightenment. And so I think post-Enlightenment, I have a difficult time imagining a future where we all get locked in to a set of values which are making everybody miserable, but nobody thinks to question them. And this is one of the things he says somewhere, which is that he's worried about us all getting locked into a state of nature where we're all being made absolutely miserable. It's in the future. So there's obviously communication and stuff, but no one challenges these values. Like once you have a dystopia like that, like this is a problem to be solved. And I think like the history of the 20th century and the Cold War in particular, like highlights that totalitarian regimes just aren't fundamentally stable because you don't have flourishing and people want to have a better life for themselves and their children. And they're naturally going to start challenging certain values like slavery, like anti-Semitism, like these kind of values which are creating misery. And so I didn't find it very persuasive, and also because most of what he argued was like an AGI getting into power and locking in these values. And like, we don't need to talk too much about the AGI stuff because we talked about that ad nauseum, but he used historical examples in AGI. And I don't think either of these things work for different reasons, but the historical examples in particular, it's pre-Enlightenment. And so the world is just a very different place post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution. So all in all, I didn't find that too persuasive, but I guess
you're making me realize that I guess there's two different kinds of value lock-in that maybe he distinguished, but I can't remember. So one is sort of what he talked about with just ideas winning out over one another. And there I agree with you. It's hard to imagine a world right now where everyone just starts to think a certain way and it's making us miserable and no one thinks to question it, especially with things like the proliferation of the internet and stuff. But then there's the question of like, okay, but like if the values were enforced from top down, and he goes like the AGI route, but you can even just imagine like a North Korea type situation, right? Like North Korea takes over the world. There you have certain ideas enforced. And it's not that no one thinks to question them. It's just that no one can question them because you're living under some form of dictatorship. And so to that, I say, yeah, that would be shitty. I think no one wants to live in a dictatorship. And so that was kind of one of the things where I was like, yeah, I mean, that's a problem. If you can point to something right now and say, this is a sign of a dictatorship and I'm getting really worried about it, like, I don't know, so some country is like sliding into some sort of dictatorship, then yeah, that'd be a problem we should worry about. And then we'd start dealing with it as best we can. But without that sort of concrete problem to point at, aside from the actual dictatorships that are surviving right now, something I'm not sure what to do with that information, right? It's kind of again one of those vacuous things where everyone can agree that's a problem. That would be shitty. Obviously, we should kind of be on guard for that, but it's quite unclear what to do about that, right? It's not really going to change my day-to-day life, right?
Yeah. So you were going through the structure of the book, and I thought that was super useful. So I derailed it slightly by asking a question, but perhaps you want to finish the structure of the book.
Right. So part 2, trajectory changes. Part 3, safeguarding civilization. And then, okay, we should go at this a bit. So part 4 is an introduction to population ethics.
Fucking population ethics. I can't stand population ethics. Yeah.
Population ethics is the study of how to compare different populations of abstract people, basically. So these are the classic questions of like, is it good to bring life with positive utility into existence? How do I compare a population of people with a population of 1,000 people with utility 75 against a population of 1 billion people with utility 45 and stuff, right? And like,
and this was Derek Parfit's like the one who created this field.
Yeah, he created this field.
And would you say it's a field, or is it more just like an area?
I don't know. I've been meaning to I've been meaning to look at like a textbook on population ethics and see one, like how big, like how well founded, like how many people are studying population ethics. Like, I don't know, because the part that really bugs me here is in the book and in interviews, MacAskill will say like any view you have on these questions leads you to paradoxes, right? So he'll say like, but then what that means, I think we actually talked about this in like one of the earliest episodes, but what that means in technical terms is if you are willing to assign one number that captures a person's utility and you're willing to aggregate that utility over everyone living, right? So you're allowing basically to sum up the utility of a bunch of people living in a world and say that this world has utility A. If you allow sort of like moral mathematics like that, then you run into problems of like basic arithmetic, which is quite clear.
Basic arithmetic leading to conclusions that people find repugnant. That's the
exactly. So you end up preferring a huge world with tons of people where everyone's like just above misery to a world full of a much smaller world full of like very, very happy people. In some sense, it's true to say that is like an impossibility result, he'll call it, but it leaves out the axiom that you have to be willing to like assign a number, like a number that captures the utility of an entire world. And so I'm not sure where to go with this exactly. Like we could actually talk about population ethics, but even in service of the whole book, I was quite unclear about what this chapter was doing. Like to my eye, like I don't think you really have to argue that the world ending tomorrow is a bad thing. Maybe there's a few people like David Benatar who would think it's a great thing, but I don't think they're reading this book anyway. And so I was kind of unclear what that chapter was about, except for like maybe signaling some philosophical bona fides or something.
I totally agree. And it's like, for me, when I read about the repugnant conclusion, it's just so obvious to me that it's like, we can't reduce the well-being of a human to a single number and compare them. And so that's the axiom that I'm saying, I want to get rid of this one. Let's not try to compare my well-being against your well-being, because it can't be done. And I view the repugnant conclusion as just showing that it can't be done. But philosophers view this as being the focus of like PhD dissertations and stuff, because for some reason they don't want to stop this game of assigning util points to human beings.
Well, I think what they would argue is like, well, they would say, this is just an abstraction of what we have to do in like public policy anyway, for example, right? Like there we have to compare the effect of certain policy decisions on groups of people. One could benefit and like a larger group of people to a lesser extent. One could benefit a smaller number of people to a greater extent. How do we think about those kind of trade-offs? And then population ethics just emerges from there.
But it can't be divorced from the concrete problem.
Exactly.
Like I agree. I agree that you have to make these kind of trade-offs. And for certain cases, it's a good heuristic to simplify people to single well-being points. But when you try to apply this to every problem and divorce it from real world situations, then you lead to absurdities. And so, okay, we can't do that. Also in public policy, you don't have the option of adding a population of 150 billion barely happy people. Like you can't just make up people out of the void like this. When you're talking about real people's real lives, sometimes you do have to make simplifying assumptions, and that's only to make progress on real, concrete, tangible, specific problems. In terms of what it was doing in the service of the book, like I guess it's because we're talking about the well-being of a potentially infinite future population. And so the philosophical area that deals with this is population ethics. But I honestly, I just read part of it and skipped it because it just seemed to be completely unnecessary for what he was trying to say. So I couldn't give you a concrete answer for why that chapter was there.
I think maybe like the distinction between someone like you and someone who finds that chapter very necessary is an interesting focus on consistency. So I think someone would want to say, I don't want to have beliefs in like the public policy realm unless they can be extrapolated to every possible abstract world, lest I realize like my beliefs are being inconsistent in some way. And this is also interesting related to like Dutch books arguments and stuff, right? Arguments in favor of Bayesianism. There it's like all about at every moment in time, you want to have consistent beliefs, right? You don't want to bet like 51% on something and then 52% on its opposite. And then people are going to be able to like make bets against you. Yeah, I don't know. There's some focus on like, obviously having consistent beliefs is a good thing. But there's something with like, you take this to the limit and I'm not sure exactly what's going on there.
Well, I have some thoughts there. So the focus on consistency, I think it's moral philosophers are trying to do what mathematicians do, which is come up with like a perfect framework. They have one framework, call it utilitarianism, and they have another framework, call it consequentialism. And they're trying to find a framework which can answer all moral questions, no matter how difficult or complicated. And they'll never be able to do this. And so what happens is they come up with some perfect framework, and then everyone finds counterexamples to show that this leads to moral scenarios which violate our moral intuitions. And then everyone throws up their hands. The person who's made the most amount of sense on moral philosophy for me is Noah Smith, who in one podcast interview, he said, I don't have a moral framework. What I have are basic moral intuitions that sometimes can map onto some frameworks occasionally. But the main thing that I use are my intuitions. And then I use these frameworks to kind of help me think through corner cases a little bit. But I think that is consistent because it's not attempting to come up with a perfect framework. It's just recognizing that so much of our moral decision-making is based on these evolutionary pre-programmed intuitions we have. And that's kind of what I want to say too. Like I have certain intuitions about the morality of slavery, and I have other intuitions about the morality of eating meat. And for whatever reason, like I don't wake up every morning thinking too much about the suffering of chickens and cows. Other people do, and power to them. But I'm riding on my moral intuitions here. And so I think that that's not an inconsistent worldview. It's more just an acknowledgement that this is what most people are doing most of the time. And frameworks can sometimes help to think through the corner cases occasionally, but we shouldn't seek to find a perfect framework. And this is like foundationalism, to use a Deutschian term, but it's just seeking this perfect thing that can answer all future questions is a futile quest. And instead we should try to reason through our moral intuitions and use these frameworks occasionally when they're helpful. But in all instances, we have to just go case by case, instance by instance. Yeah. I don't know. Did any of that land?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm trying to think what someone more sympathetic to population ethics would say. And I think they would say like, well, formalizing things lets you spot errors in your reasoning or gaps in your intuition or like conflicts in your intuition, right? Like you can't simultaneously think, I don't know, that like bestiality is wrong, but like for the reason because it like violates an animal's what's the word I'm looking
bodily
for?
Sovereignty or something.
But exactly, like
bodily autonomy.
There we go. Violates their autonomy, and but then simultaneously be okay with like killing them for food.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess that's not a situation in which you're like putting numbers on things. You're just like making an argument that these two are inconsistent. But I think what people are trying to do when they're putting numbers on things is abstract away the details so that you can see if you hold two completely incompatible views. Then there's the question of like, well, once you've done the abstraction, if you find an incompatibility, is that actually telling you anything useful about the world? And I think you would say no, and they would say yes. And maybe that's what the difference is. Like, what's the actual?
I wouldn't necessarily say no. I wouldn't necessarily say no. Like, if anything, the bestiality and vegetarian example makes me more pro bestiality than I would have been before. And so
at least you're being consistent.
I think you're like pointing out contradictions. Excuse me. I think pointing out contradictions is very important. And there are many times when our moral intuitions do need to be changed. So I'm not saying moral intuitions are always right, by no means. I'm more saying moral intuitions are my starting point, and then they need to be kind of buffeted and constrained and directed by kind of moral argument. But that's not the same as saying I seek a perfect moral framework that can answer all problems between now and the end of time. And then to throw up my hands in despair when I find counter examples to these frameworks. Because like so often MacAskill will talk about how like expected value theory is there's lots of problems with it, but it's the best tool we have. And it's like he's seeking a perfect framework. And so it's like, if it's not expected value reasoning, then show me a different framework that has fewer problems rather than just trying to overcome this need to have a perfect question answering framework. Like It's like they want like a fountain of wisdom that they can just ask questions to and have it tell them what to do in all these moral circumstances. When really we should just recognize we have to go circumstance by circumstance and not try to find the perfect framework.
Yeah. I mean, okay. I guess we've talked about expected value enough.
Yeah.
So we should steer away from that. But I totally agree. Like the difference between public policy and population ethics is you're constrained by the actual policies that you're considering. And so you're not in this abstracted world with utilities. And it's like very specific to the problem at hand. And also in public policy, you can also always come up with new options. Whereas like the population ethics is very sort of game theoretic in nature, where like you have a set of options in front of you and that's all you're allowed to do because you've abstracted yourself into this mathematical world. Obviously, you can't just like create new options. You can't say, maybe this third policy is better. And so, which of course is how real life works. And then that's almost the last chapter. The last chapter is taking action, which is
just a tiny clarification. So the last part, so the book is split into 5 parts of which there are 10 chapters. Yeah. So the last part 5 consists of chapter 10.
Yeah. Part 5 is solely chapter 10, which is just about taking action, which we talked a little bit about earlier. Like he talks about what people can do, which in the abstract is quite vacuous, but then gives example of people who are working on problems. But like we said earlier, to work on those problems, you don't need to adopt long-termism. And so I found that chapter to be quite underwhelming. And even he himself, like I was talking about the Tim Ferriss podcast earlier, and on there, Tim Ferriss kind of presses him and says like where should people donate? Like what should we do? Like what are some wins, some concrete wins from long-termism? And MacAskill gives a few examples. He gives the example of far UVC. So this is like a type of lighting, I guess, that treats rooms for certain bacteria, right? So
I thought again was a great example of that's totally
one of the
reasonable.
Coolest. Yeah. And then he says early detection of new pathogens, which is related. Also, like obviously, better PPE equipment for people working with dangerous chemicals, and then some technical AI safety stuff, which again is mostly cashed out in terms of just giving money to PhD students who are doing classic ML research, just focused on robustness and whatnot. No, I think that's all I got. I mean, the taking action is the last part of the book. It's good, but doesn't seem to require long-termism. And so, like, one thing I couldn't help think while reading the book was like, presumably if you introduce like a new view, right? So if I was to introduce like a new scientific theory and it agreed with general relativity 99.5% of the time, that's not a benefit of the new theory, right? You wouldn't take that as evidence that the theory was true. What you'd look at is the 0.5% of times where it deviates from general relativity and say, does it make better predictions in that area, right? So sort of like the difference, the delta between these two theories. And I was trying to do that a bit with long-termism, like insofar as it doesn't line up with what I think most people would consider to be totally valid problems. What more is it recommending beyond that? And the answer seems to be relatively vague things and then some AI stuff. And so considering that delta, it's not the most impressive thing ever. Yeah.
But I also think that the consequence of this kind of book, and I include Toby Ord, is that in 5 years, and this is a falsifiable prediction, that in 5 years, long-termist research is going to be dominating the EA giving space than, say, global poverty research, which is what MacAskill's first book was focused on. And that's going to hurt real people, where there's a finite amount of malarial bed nets, etc. And if funding for these kind of concrete problems is being siphoned away, and instead we're getting AI research, AI safety research, and long-termism research, etc., that's going to hurt real people. And I think that this book definitely, I think it's contributing to that while being able to deny it. And that's maybe an unfair critique, but that's my honest impression, that like the book is so anodyne, but it's like a gateway drug to the more intense stuff, which is on the internet and which MacAskill's written himself. And so it's just a strange kind of superposition between dangerous and banal, I guess.
So I read the book once, or I listened to it, and then prepping for it, I read a few more chapters. I've never had like kind of less interesting things to say about a book I've actually dedicated time to thinking about. Like I almost feel like embarrassed that I don't have that much to say, but I truly was just kind of at a loss for like what to think. Like sometimes I'd be like, I mean, taking the future seriously, that's a good idea. Humans are cool. I want to see us flourish. That's great. Other times I'm like, you're talking about AI replicating, taking over the world. Like, you know, this is crazy. And so it's just such a bizarre thing to read. Like, and I couldn't tell, like, am I just too deep in the
and
EA
also because
circles? Like,
it's like there was nothing terribly new, but it was just like a boring version of stuff we've already talked about before, you know?
Exactly.
So it wasn't like there's a couple things like the vaccines on the free market. I thought that was a great idea. Hadn't heard that, hadn't thought about that before. Seemed obviously like, duh. But most of it is like, okay, here's the expected value stuff. Here's the AI stuff. Like the value lock-in.
Like checklist. Like, okay, here we go.
Didn't find it too persuasive. But yeah, in general, I agree. It's time to move on.
It's a weird space, man. It's weird. I mean, even like Sam Harris, like, he'll like have him on. They'll like get excited about the ideas. But I have to wonder, like, is this influencing Sam's actual give? Like, I know he donates like a lot of money, you know, with his foundation and stuff. The last I checked, he donated a bunch of stuff to like Afghan refugees or something. I don't think that's a long-termist cause. Like, I'm like, is this like, there's some like, is this just intellectual cotton candy or something that people are just like eating up because it's like
a new thing. It's like fun. And there was a huge splash when MacAskill went on the podcast circuit, but like then it was gone radio silent.
Totally.
And maybe it's just going to be radio silent forever. Like, what has he actually advocated that we do differently?
Exactly.
Donate more to like fossil fuel replacements, and like, okay, great, man. I agree. We should do that. But
but I also don't want civilization to collapse. Like, I agree. Now, what's one concrete thing that I can do to avoid that? Like, exactly.
Learn more, man. Yeah, you can learn more
and donate.
It's like, learn and donate. It's oh goodness.
I'm not sure I have much more to say, to be honest.
Me too, dude. Me too. I think we've been going for an hour and a half, so nice. We definitely got a bunch out there. So I don't know what we're gonna do next time. I think we're having some guests on at some point. Yes. But we should be careful not to announce them because
you never know.
You never know. But hopefully that'll happen soon. And this will probably be the last thing we say about long-termism unless MacAskill writes another book. But
yeah, I hope so at least. I want to move on.
But cool, man. Well, this is fun.
Nice, dude. All right.
Peace.
Take care.